The cold metal felt different in her hands that morning. June 6, 1944. Dawn hadn't yet broken over the English Channel. But Dorothy Mae Sullivan knew that within hours, everything she had trained for, everything she had sacrificed, every moment of ridicule and doubt she had endured, would be put to the ultimate test. The 23-year-old markswoman from rural Montana stood on the deck of the USS Samuel Chase, her modified M1 Garand strapped across her back in a way that made every other soldier shake their heads. They had laughed at her rigging method for months. They called it crazy, unconventional, dangerous even. But Dorothy had stopped caring about their opinions the day she realized that surviving war meant doing things your own way, not their way. The story of how Dorothy Mae Sullivan became one of the most lethal snipers in the Normandy invasion begins not on the beaches of France, but in the wheat fields of Montana, where a young girl learned that being underestimated could be the greatest advantage of all. Now, I know that our audience is made up of intelligent and exigent people like you, who appreciate real stories of courage that history tried to forget. If you value content that brings these untold stories to light with respect and depth, subscribe to this channel. We're building a community that refuses to let these voices fade into silence. Dorothy was born in the harsh winter of 1921 in a small town called Shelby, Montana, where the wind cut through plains like a knife and survival meant learning to be resourceful before you learned to read. Her father, Thomas Sullivan, was a wheat farmer who had fought in the First World War, and he returned home with a Purple Heart, a limp that never quite healed, and a silence about the things he had seen that hung over their farmhouse like morning fog. Her mother, Catherine, was a schoolteacher who believed that education was the only way out of poverty, but she also understood that in Montana in the 1920s, a girl needed more than books to survive. She needed to know how to shoot. Thomas began teaching Dorothy to handle a rifle when she was 7 years old, not for sport, not for hobby, but because coyotes threatened their livestock, because food sometimes meant hunting, and because he had a daughter, not a son, and he refused to let that be a limitation. On Sunday mornings, when other families went to church in town, the Sullivans held their own service in the far fields. Thomas would set up tin cans on fence posts, and Dorothy would learn to breathe, to squeeze, to become one with the weapon in her hands. By the time she was 12, she could hit a moving target at 300 yards. By 15, she was better than any boy in the county, and the boys knew it, which made school a special kind of hell. The Great Depression hit Montana like a second winter. Wheat prices collapsed. Banks foreclosed on farms that had stood for generations. Dorothy watched her father age 10 years in the span of 2, watched him struggle to keep food on their table, watched her mother take on extra work tutoring children in town just to afford basic necessities. When Dorothy graduated from high school in 1939, there was no money for college, no prospect beyond becoming a teacher herself or marrying one of the local boys who looked at her with a mixture of desire and resentment because she could outshoot them all. But Dorothy had inherited something from both her parents. Her father's stubbornness and her mother's belief that life could be bigger than the circumstances you were born into. She took a job at the local general store, saving every penny she could, reading every newspaper that came through, watching as the world beyond Montana began to tear itself apart. By 1941, war in Europe wasn't just headlines anymore. It was coming, inevitable as a storm rolling across the plains. And when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, everything changed. The United States entered the war, and suddenly, Shelby, Montana was no longer isolated from the world's problems. Young men enlisted by the dozens, eager to prove themselves, eager to be heroes. Dorothy watched them go, watched the town empty of its sons, and she felt something stirring inside her that she couldn't quite name. It wasn't patriotism in the way the posters described it, all flag-waving in glory. It was something raw, something that had to do with feeling powerless her entire life, and suddenly seeing a door crack open, even if it was a door marked men only. Women were joining the war effort in unprecedented numbers. They were working in factories, building planes and tanks, serving as nurses, driving ambulances. But Dorothy didn't want to rivet metal or tend wounds. She wanted to fight. She wanted to use the one skill she had that was better than any man's. She wanted to shoot. The problem was that in 1942, the United States military didn't officially allow women in combat roles. There were no women infantry, no women snipers, no place for someone like Dorothy Mae Sullivan in the front lines of war. But war creates exceptions, and desperation makes room for the unconventional. The Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, was recruiting specialists for covert operations. They needed people with unique skills, people who could blend in, people who could do things that regular soldiers couldn't. And they needed sharpshooters. When a recruiter came through Montana looking for marksmen to test for a special program, Dorothy showed up at the recruitment center in Great Falls, the only woman among 47 men. The sergeant behind the desk looked at her like she had made a wrong turn. He was a thick-necked man from Texas with a mustache that drooped past his chin and eyes that had seen too many wannabe heroes wash out in training. His name was Sergeant Williams, and he did not want to deal with a woman that day, or any day. He told her politely but firmly that the testing was for men only, that she should consider joining the Women's Army Corps, where she could serve her country in appropriate ways, typing reports or organizing supplies. Dorothy stood her ground. She asked him one simple question. What's the qualification distance for the marksmanship test? 500 yards. He told her, expecting that to end the conversation. She asked if she could try. He laughed, not unkindly, but the kind of laugh that said he had seen this before. Young people who thought they were special, who thought they were different, who washed out before lunch. He told her she could try if she brought her own weapon and ammunition, which he assumed she didn't have. Dorothy went back to her truck and returned with her father's Winchester Model 70, the rifle she had been shooting since she was tall enough to hold it properly. Sergeant Williams set up the test more out of amusement than genuine evaluation. He walked her out to the range where the men were gathered, waiting their turns, and he announced that they had a lady who wanted to try her hand at marksmanship. The laughter was immediate and mean-spirited. The kind of laughter that makes clear you are not welcome, that you are entertainment at best. Dorothy ignored them. She had been ignored or laughed at her entire life. She was good at tuning out noise. The target was a standard military silhouette at 500 yards, barely visible to the naked eye under the harsh Montana sun. The wind was gusting from the west at about 15 miles per hour, enough to push a bullet significantly off course if you didn't compensate. The men had been shooting all morning, and the best score so far was 6 out of 10 hits on target. Dorothy stepped up to the firing line, checked her rifle, loaded 5 rounds into magazine, and settled into position. She didn't rush. She breathed the way her father had taught her, slow and steady, feeling the rhythm of her own heartbeat, timing her shots between beats. She fired 5 rounds in less than 40 seconds. All 5 hit center mass. The men stopped laughing. Sergeant Williams walked down to check the target himself, not quite believing what he had just witnessed. When he came back, his expression had changed. He asked her if she wanted to go again, double or nothing. Dorothy loaded 5 more rounds. 5 more hits, grouped so tightly that 3 of them overlapped. The range went silent, except for the wind whipping through the grass. Williams looked at her for a long moment, then asked her if she could do that with a military-issue rifle, because the Winchester was a hunting rifle, designed for accuracy in ways that the standard M1 Garand was not. Dorothy had never fired an M1 Garand in her life. The Garand was a standard service rifle of the U.S. military, a semi-automatic weapon that was rugged, reliable, and powerful, but it was not known for long-range precision. It was a battle rifle, meant for infantry combat at shorter distances. Snipers typically use specially selected rifles with high-quality barrels and custom stocks. But Williams handed her a Garand from the armory, a standard-issue rifle that had been used in training exercises. Nothing special about it at all. He gave her 8 rounds, the standard M-block clip capacity of the Garand, and told her to show him what she could do. The M1 Garand felt different from her Winchester. It was heavier, front-loaded, with a different balance and a different trigger pull. The sights were military peep sights, designed for rapid target acquisition, not precision shooting. But Dorothy understood something fundamental about marksmanship that most people never learned. The weapon was just metal and wood. The real accuracy came from the shooter, from understanding your body, your breath, your nerves. She made adjustments mentally, compensating for the difference in weight distribution, for the slightly heavier trigger pull. She fired 8 rounds. 7 hit the target. 6 of them were kill shots. One was low and to the right, catching the edge of silhouette. For a weapon she had never fired before, in conditions that were far from ideal, it was an extraordinary performance. Sergeant Williams was a career military man who had seen thousands of recruits try to prove themselves, and he recognized immediately that he was looking at a natural talent that came along maybe once in a generation. He told Dorothy to wait while he made some phone calls. 3 hours later, she was on her way to Washington, D.C. for evaluation by OSS officers who specialized in unconventional warfare. The training that followed was unlike anything the regular military offered. Dorothy was sent to a classified facility in Virginia, where the OSS trained operatives in skills that range from hand-to-hand combat to sabotage, from languages to survival techniques. There were other women in the program, which surprised her, women from all over the country who had been recruited for their unique abilities. Some were polyglots who could speak 5 or 6 languages fluently. Some were demolition experts who understood explosives better than most engineers. Some were radio operators who could transmit coded messages under impossible conditions. And Dorothy was a sniper. The training was brutal and comprehensive. She learned to shoot not just with a Garand, but with every weapon the Allies used and many that the Axis forces carried. She learned to estimate distances by eye, to read wind speed from the movement of grass and leaves, to calculate bullet drop based on temperature and altitude. She learned fieldcraft, how to move silently through terrain, how to construct a hide site that could keep her concealed for days. She learned to slow her heart rate, to control her breathing, to take a life from 600 yards away and feel nothing but the mathematics of the shot. But more than the technical skills, Dorothy learned about herself. She learned that she was capable of violence in ways that frightened her, that there was a coldness inside her that could switch on when needed, turning her into something more like a machine than a woman. The instructors called it compartmentalization, the ability to separate emotion from action, to kill without hesitation when the mission required it. Some recruits couldn't develop this trait, no matter how hard they trained. They washed out, sent back to conventional roles where the moral burden was more distributed, where you could fire into an enemy position without knowing exactly whose life you were ending. But Dorothy discovered that she had a capacity for this kind of focused violence that disturbed her instructors as much as it impressed them. There was one training exercise that stayed with her, that haunted her dreams for months afterward. The instructor, a man named Colonel Hastings who had served in the Spanish Civil War, told the trainees that they needed to understand the psychological reality of sniping. It wasn't like infantry combat where adrenaline and chaos and the fear of being killed yourself could carry you through the act of killing. Sniping was intimate despite the distance. You watched your target through your scope. You saw them as a person, doing human things, drinking coffee, reading a letter, laughing with a comrade. And then you killed them. You had to be able to live with that, Hastings said, or you would break in the field. He made them practice on photographs of German soldiers, real photographs taken by reconnaissance, photos that showed their faces clearly. The trainees had to study these photos, memorize the features, imagine these men as real people with families and hopes and fears, and then take aim shots at silhouettes marked with the same numbers as the photos. It was a psychological exercise designed to break down the abstraction of the enemy, to force them to confront the human cost of what they would be doing. Some trainees refused to complete the exercise. Dorothy completed it without hesitation, and that's when Colonel Hastings pulled her aside and told her that she had the makings of an exceptional operator, but she needed to be careful. People who could kill without emotional struggle sometimes struggled to stop killing when the war was over. The modifications to her rifle began as a solution to a problem that the male instructors didn't fully understand. The M1 Garand, like most military weapons, was designed with average male body proportions in mind. The length of pull, the distance from the trigger to the buttstock, was standardized for men who were typically 5'9" to 6 feet tall. Dorothy was 5'4", with smaller hands and shorter arms. When she shouldered the standard Garand, she had to stretch slightly to reach the trigger comfortably, which threw off her natural point of aim and made long-duration shooting positions painful and unstable. The armory sergeant, a gruff old-timer named Murphy who had been maintaining weapons since before Dorothy was born, told her that she just needed to adapt, that every soldier had to make compromises with their equipment. But Dorothy had grown up on a farm where tools were modified and adapted constantly, where you made things work with what you had because buying new was an option. She asked Murphy if she could work in the armory during her off hours, if she could experiment with her issued Garand to find solutions. Murphy, who respected craftsmanship even if he didn't think women belonged in combat, agreed on the condition that she didn't permanently damage any military property. Dorothy began by adjusting the buttstock. She carved down the standard wooden stock, removing material from the length to bring the trigger closer without compromising the structural integrity of the rifle. It was delicate work, requiring precision and an understanding of how wood grain affected strength. Too much removed, and the stock would crack under recoil. Too little, and the modification would be pointless. She worked at night in the armory, using hand tools, shaping the stock by feel as much as by measurement. Murphy watched her work with growing respect, occasionally offering advice, usually just staying quiet and letting her figure out. But the stock modification alone wasn't enough. The Garand's weight distribution still felt wrong for Dorothy's frame and shooting style. The rifle was nose-heavy, which worked well for standing and kneeling positions but was awkward for prone shooting, especially over extended periods. Dorothy had learned from her father that weight and balance were everything in precision shooting. A rifle that felt natural, that became an extension of your body, always outperformed a more powerful weapon that fought against you. She started experimenting with the sling configuration. The standard military sling for the Garand was designed primarily as a carrying strap, with a secondary function of providing support in shooting positions. But Dorothy understood that a properly rigged sling could do much more. She had read about competitive shooters who used highly specialized sling techniques to create bone-supported positions that were rock-steady. She began adapting these techniques for field use, creating a rigging method that looked bizarre but worked perfectly for her body mechanics. The method involved wrapping the sling around her support arm in a way that created tension between the rifle and her skeletal structure, essentially turning her left arm into a stable shooting platform. It required the sling to be adjusted to a precise length and threaded to the front swivel in an unconventional manner. When properly set up, Dorothy could hold the rifle aimed at a target for several minutes without muscle fatigue, with the weapon's weight distributed through bone rather than being held by muscle strength. For a woman of her size trying to use a rifle designed for larger men, this was a revolutionary advantage. The first time she demonstrated this rigging method on the range, the instructors thought she had set it up incorrectly. The sling was wrapped so tightly around her arm that it cut off circulation, turning her hand slightly purple. She had to loosen and retighten it each time she took a shot. It looked painful and inefficient. But when Dorothy settled into position and started putting rounds through the same hole at 400 yards, the instructor stopped criticizing and started paying attention. The other trainees, mostly men who had been shooting since childhood and considered themselves experts, looked at her rigging method and dismissed it as a gimmick that worked for her but would never be practical in combat conditions. They were wrong about that, but Dorothy didn't argue with them. She had learned young that the best way to deal with skepticism was to let your results speak for themselves. While the other marksmen in her training cohort focused on speed and volume of fire, Dorothy focused on making every single shot count. She practiced in rain, in wind, in darkness, in every uncomfortable position she could think of. She taught herself to build her sling rig in under 30 seconds, even with cold or injured hands. She learned to ignore the pain of the tight sling cutting into her arm, to see it as just another sensation that had no bearing on the task at hand. By the time her training was complete in early 1944, Dorothy Mae Sullivan had become something that didn't officially exist in the U.S. military, a female sniper. The designation on her papers was vague, listed as a specialist attached to the OSS for reconnaissance purposes. Her security clearance was higher than most officers. Her mission parameters were classified in ways that meant even discussing her role could lead to court-martial. And as Allied forces prepared for the largest amphibious invasion in history, Dorothy learned that she would be among the first wave hitting Omaha Beach on D-Day. The preparation for Normandy consumed the first months of 1944. Dorothy was assigned to a special operations unit tasked with providing precision fire support during the initial assault and the push inland. The unit was small, just 12 specialists, each with unique skills. There were demolition experts who would target specific strong points, radio operators who would coordinate naval gunfire, and Dorothy, whose job was to eliminate high-value targets. Officers, machine gun crews, forward observers directing German artillery, anyone whose death would create maximum disruption to enemy defenses. She was issued standard infantry gear plus specialized equipment for her role. Camouflage netting, a waterproof case for her rifle, extra ammunition, more than a standard rifleman would carry, a spotting scope, maps of the Normandy coast that showed every German position that Allied intelligence had identified. She studied those maps until she could close her eyes and see the terrain, memorizing distances, sight lines, potential hide sites. She knew that the moment she hit the beach, there would be no time for planning or preparation. Everything would have to be instinct and training. The night before they shipped out from England, Dorothy sat alone in her barracks and wrote a letter to her parents. She couldn't tell them where she was going or what she would be doing, but she wanted them to know that everything they had taught her, every lesson learned in the wheat fields of Montana, every value they had instilled about courage and duty and doing what was right even when it was hard, had led her to this moment. She told them she loved them. She told them she was proud to be their daughter. She sealed the letter and gave it to the chaplain with instructions to mail it only if she didn't return, which was a real possibility that everyone was thinking about but nobody was saying out loud. June 5th, 1944. The invasion fleet assembled in the English Channel. Thousands of ships carrying tens of thousands of men toward the coast of France. Dorothy boarded the USS Samuel Chase with her unit, along with elements of the 16th Infantry Regiment. The seas were rough, and many men were seasick, vomiting over the rails, their faces green with nausea and fear. Dorothy felt both emotions but refused to show either. She checked and rechecked her equipment, made sure her rifle was properly secured in its waterproof case, tried to sleep knowing that sleep would be impossible. In the dark hours before dawn on June 6, the ships reached their positions off Omaha Beach. Dorothy could hear the naval bombardment, the massive guns of the battleships and cruisers pounding German positions with high-explosive shells. The sound was like continuous thunder, and the sky flashed with explosions that lit up the clouds in shades of orange and red. The plan called for this bombardment to destroy or suppress most of the German defenses, but Dorothy had enough training to know that plans rarely survive contact with reality. The Germans had been fortifying this coastline for years. They would be ready. The landing craft were loaded in darkness, men clambering down cargo nets into the small Higgins boats that would carry them to shore. Dorothy was in the second wave, which meant she would hit the beach approximately 30 minutes after the first assault troops. 30 minutes to see how badly things were going, to watch men die on the beach, to understand what she was heading into. The engine of the landing craft was loud, drowning out conversation, leaving everyone alone with their thoughts as the boat churned through the choppy waters toward shore. As dawn broke, Dorothy could see the beach for the first time. It was nothing like the maps and photographs. The naval bombardment had not destroyed the German defenses. The beach was a killing field, littered with obstacles and bodies and disabled vehicles. The first wave had been decimated, pinned down at the water's edge by interlocking machine gun fire from positions that the bombardment had barely touched. Tracer rounds cut through the air like deadly fireflies. Explosions threw up geysers of sand and water. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous roar of gunfire and screaming and the whistling of incoming artillery. The ramp of Dorothy's landing craft dropped, and the men in front of her rushed into chest-deep water. Immediately, several of them fell, hit by machine gun fire that swept across the waterline. Dorothy plunged in after them, holding her rifle case above her head, struggling through the water as bullets churned the surf around her. A man next to her took a round to the neck and went down, the water turning red around him. Another made it 3 steps and was hit in the chest. Dorothy kept moving, focused on reaching the beach, on getting to cover, on surviving the next 10 seconds and then the 10 after that. She made to the sand and ran, low and fast, toward a disabled tank that offered some cover. Machine gun fire kicked up sand around her feet. She dove behind the tank and pressed herself flat, breathing hard, trying to think through the chaos. Other soldiers were huddled behind the same tank, some wounded, all terrified. The beach was a nightmare, worse than anything the training had prepared them for. The German positions were perfectly sighted, covering every avenue of approach with overlapping fields of fire. Men were dying by the dozens, their bodies accumulating at the waterline, where successive waves of landing craft continued to disgorge more troops into the meat grinder. Dorothy knew she had to move inland, had to get off this beach where there were nothing but targets. She looked up at the bluffs overlooking the beach, at the German positions dug into the heights, and she understood that this was her target environment. Those machine gun nests, those observation posts, that's what she was here for. But first she had to survive long enough to get into position, and that meant crossing 200 yards of open beach under fire, which seemed impossible until she realized that impossible was just another word for something nobody had succeeded at yet. She waited for a lull in the firing, which happened every few minutes when the German gunners had to reload or when smoke from explosions obscured their sight lines. When the moment came, Dorothy sprinted toward a crater blown by naval gunfire, diving into it as machine gun fire erupted again. She lay in the crater, catching her breath, then repeated the process, moving from cover to cover, working her way toward the base of the bluffs. It took her 20 minutes to cover 200 yards, 20 minutes of terror and sprinting and diving, but she made it, and more importantly, she made it with her rifle intact and her body unwounded. At the base of the bluffs, there was a narrow beach where a few soldiers had managed to gather, using the vertical terrain to shield themselves from the machine gun positions above. An officer, a captain whose name Dorothy never learned, was trying to organize an assault up the bluff using a narrow ravine that provided some dead space from German fire. He saw Dorothy, saw her specialist designation, and asked if she could provide covering fire. Dorothy told him she could do better than that. She could eliminate the machine gun positions if he could get her to a position with sight lines. The captain looked at her skeptically, the small woman with a rifle rigged in a strange way, but he was desperate and out of options. He detailed 2 soldiers to guide her up a goat path that climbed the bluff at an angle, reaching a small plateau about halfway up where the German fire couldn't reach. It was dangerous, expose any Germans who might be looking down from above, but it was the only way to get into a firing position. Dorothy and the 2 soldiers climbed, slipping on loose rock, pulling themselves up using grass and whatever handhold they could find. One of the soldiers was hit by a stray round and fell, tumbling down the bluff, but Dorothy and the other soldier made it to the plateau. From this position, Dorothy had a partial view of the beach and a better view of some of the German positions. She could see a machine gun nest about 300 yards away, dug into the hillside with sandbags and camouflage netting, muzzle flash visible every time it fired. That position was killing men on the beach, and it had to be stopped. Dorothy opened her rifle case, assembled her weapon with practiced movements, and set up her unconventional sling rig. The soldier with her watched in confusion as she wrapped the sling tightly around her arm, adjusting the tension, creating her bone-supported platform. Then she settled into prone position, found the machine gun nest in her sights, and waited. Patience was the mark of a good sniper. Dorothy watched the position, noting the rhythm of fire, tried to see through the camouflage to identify the gunners. She could see 2 men, maybe 3, one firing while others fed ammunition belts and watched for targets. She needed to hit the gunner first, then the loader before they could react. The distance was manageable, but the wind off the ocean was gusty and unpredictable. She watched grass and leaves, judging wind speed and direction, making calculations in her head. Then, between heartbeats, she took her shot. The Garand's report was sharp and distinctive, different from the continuous chatter of machine guns and the deeper boom of artillery. Dorothy worked the action, the rifle's semi-automatic mechanism chambering another round automatically. She saw the first German gunner slump forward, hit in the head or upper chest. The second German, the loader, looked up in confusion, trying to figure out where the shot had come from. Dorothy put a round through his chest before he could react. The machine gun position went silent. On the beach below, men who had been pinned down began to move forward, taking advantage of the sudden respite from fire. But Dorothy wasn't done. She traversed her rifle, looking for other targets, other positions that were killing American soldiers. She saw a German officer in a different position, watching the beach through binoculars, probably coordinating defensive fire. She estimated the distance at 400 yards, adjusted for wind, and dropped him with a single shot. She found a mortar crew setting up to fire on a landing craft, and she methodically shot the three-man crew before they could get a round off. Each shot was clean, mechanical, exactly as she had been trained. She didn't think about the men she was killing. They were just targets, problems to be solved, threats to be eliminated. The soldier who had climbed up with her was watching in amazement, trying to count how many Germans she had dropped in the span of a few minutes. He asked her how she was making these shots look so easy. Dorothy didn't answer because there was nothing easy about it, and because talking would break her concentration. She was in what her instructors had called the zone, that mental state where everything narrowed down to breathing and trigger pull and the mathematics of ballistics. She could stay in this state for hours if necessary, systematically eliminating targets until she ran out of ammunition or was killed herself. By mid-morning, Dorothy had expended all the ammunition she had brought up to the plateau, nearly 100 rounds. She had personally accounted for 17 confirmed kills, most of them German soldiers in fighting positions, but also 2 officers, 1 forward observer, and what appeared to be a company commander trying to rally his men. Her impact on the battle was disproportionate to her size or official role. The sectors where she had been firing had seen a significant reduction in effective German resistance, which allowed American troops to push inland and begin securing the beachhead. She climbed down from her position to resupply, moving through terrain that had been deadly just hours before, but was now controlled by American forces pushing up from the beach. The cost had been enormous. Bodies lay everywhere, American and German, and the wounded outnumbered the able-bodied in many units. Medics moved among the casualties doing what they could, but there were too many wounded and not enough medical supplies. Dorothy passed through this carnage feeling nothing, still in that detached operational mindset, where emotion was a liability. She found her unit, or what remained of it. 3 of the 12 specialists she had shipped out were dead. 2 more were wounded badly enough to be evacuated. The rest were scattered across the beachhead, performing various tasks. The commanding officer, a major named Donovan, saw Dorothy and asked for her report. She gave it briefly, factually, listing her confirmed kills and the position she had engaged. Donovan looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between respect and discomfort, then told her to rest and resupply because they would be moving inland within the hour. The push into Normandy over the next week was chaotic and brutal. The Allied advance was slower than planned, opposed by German forces that fought for every hedgerow and village. The terrain of Normandy, with its bocage country of small fields bordered by thick hedgerows and sunken roads, was ideal for defense and terrible for attackers. American casualties mounted as units tried to advance through this maze of natural fortifications. And in this environment, Dorothy's skills became even more valuable. Her role evolved from the specific mission of D-Day to a broader task of providing precision fire support wherever she was needed. She was attached to different units as they rotated to front lines, called in to deal with specific problems. A German sniper pinning down a company, a machine gun position that conventional assault couldn't reduce, an observation post directing artillery fire. Dorothy would arrive, assess the situation, find a firing position, and solve the problem. She became known among the infantry as the small woman with the weird rifle who never missed, and soldiers began to request her specifically when they encountered resistance they couldn't overcome. There was one engagement that particularly tested Dorothy's skills and resolve. A battalion of the 29th Infantry Division was trying to capture a small town that controlled a crossroads vital to the Allied advance. The town was defended by elements of the German parachute regiment, elite troops with excellent training and discipline. The Americans had tried 2 frontal assaults and been repulsed both times with heavy casualties. The problem was a church tower in the center town, where German observers were directing artillery fire with devastating accuracy. Every time American forces massed for an attack, artillery would rain down on them. The tower had to be cleared, but it was stone construction that resisted everything short of direct hits by heavy artillery, which the Americans didn't want to use for fear of destroying the town. Dorothy was brought in to solve the problem. She studied the church through her spotting scope from a position about 800 yards away, outside the town's defensive perimeter. She could see the observation post in the tower, could see the shapes of men moving behind the belfry openings. But this was an extremely difficult shot, much longer than her usual engagement distance, and the target was partially obscured by the church's architecture. She would have to hit a man through a narrow opening in stone, at a distance where a bullet drop became significant, in conditions where wind could push her shot off course by feet rather than inches. She spent an hour studying the tower, watching the patterns of the observers, trying to understand their routine. She noted that one man, clearly the senior observer, stayed in one position for extended periods, visible through the belfry opening as he scanned the American lines with binoculars. This would be her target, but she would only have one shot before they realized they were under sniper fire and took cover. She had to make it count. Dorothy set up her rifle with meticulous care, building her sling rig, adjusting her position until her natural point of aim was exactly on the belfry opening. She estimated the wind speed by watching smoke from fires in the town, by feeling the breeze on her face, by that intuitive sense that came from thousands of hours of practice. She calculated bullet drop for 800 yards, adjusting her point of aim to compensate. Then she waited, watching through her scope, breathing slowly, letting her heart rate settle. The German observer appeared in the belfry opening, binoculars to his eyes, scanning left to right. Dorothy exhaled halfway, held her breath, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet took just over a second to travel 800 yards. In that second, Dorothy had no idea if she had compensated correctly for wind, if her calculation of bullet drop was accurate, if the target would move at the wrong moment. Then, through her scope, she saw the German observer jerk backward and disappear from view. The observation post went silent. No more radio calls directing artillery. No more precise fires on American positions. 20 minutes later, American forces assaulted the town again, and this time they took it with minimal casualties. Dorothy never learned the name of the man she had killed in the church tower, never knew if he had a family, never wondered about who he had been before the war. He was a target she had eliminated, nothing more, nothing less. But that shot, the one at 800 yards through the narrow belfry opening, was a shot that made Dorothy's reputation among the soldiers who witnessed it. Word spread through the division about the woman sniper who had dropped a German observer from an impossible distance, and that's when the story of her rigging method began to spread as well. Soldiers who had laughed at her unconventional sling setup began to understand that it was a foundation of her accuracy, that the weird way she set up her rifle was the reason she could make shots that nobody else could make. Some tried to copy her method and found they couldn't, either because their body mechanics were different or because they didn't have 1,000 hours of practice that made it work. The rigging method was hers, personal and specific, and it couldn't be taught from a manual or learned in an afternoon. By the end of June 1944, Dorothy had been in combat for nearly a month, and the psychological toll was beginning to show. She had stopped counting her kills after reaching 23, which was a number that would later be documented in classified reports. The number was probably higher, but Dorothy had lost interest in counting. Each kill was just another task completed, another problem solved. But at night, when she tried to sleep in whatever hole or barn or ruined building her unit was occupying, she found that the faces of the men she had killed were starting to come back to her. Not during the day, not when she was working, but in those quiet moments when her mind had nothing else to focus on. She began having nightmares, dreams where she was looking through her scope, but instead of enemy soldiers, she saw her father, her mother, people from Shelby. She would wake up gasping, covered in sweat, and lie awake for hours trying to separate dream from memory. The other soldiers noticed her exhaustion, noticed the way she flinched at sudden sounds, noticed that she wasn't eating properly. But nobody said anything because everyone was carrying their own trauma. Everyone was breaking in their own way, and acknowledging it meant admitting that you might not be able to continue doing what the war required. There was a young lieutenant in the battalion Dorothy was attached to, a man named Robert Chun, whose family had come from California and who had joined up to prove his loyalty after Japanese internment. Chun was observant and compassionate in ways that combat usually eroded, and he noticed Dorothy's deteriorating condition. He pulled her aside one evening and asked her directly if she was okay. Dorothy gave him the standard answer, that she was fine, that she could still do her job. Chun didn't accept that. He told her that being a good soldier meant knowing when you were reaching your limits, meant asking for help before you broke completely. Chun convinced Dorothy to talk to battalion chaplain, a middle-aged man named Father Murphy, who had been a parish priest in Boston before the war. Murphy had heard hundreds of confessions from soldiers struggling with what they had done, and he knew better than to offer platitudes or easy absolution. He let Dorothy talk, and she told him things she hadn't told anyone, about the coldness she felt when she killed, about the fear that she would never be able to turn that coldness off, about the nightmares where killing became the only thing she knew how to do. Murphy listened without judgment, then told her something that stayed with Dorothy for the rest of her life. He said that the fact she was struggling meant she was still human, that the day she stopped feeling troubled by taking a life was a day she should worry. The capacity to kill without breaking was a gift for war, but a curse for peace, and she would need to find a way to live with both. The conversation with Father Murphy didn't make the nightmare stop, but it gave Dorothy a framework for understanding what she was experiencing. She was being changed by combat, losing pieces of the person she had been, but she hadn't lost everything yet. There was still enough of Dorothy Mae Sullivan from Shelby, Montana, to feel troubled by what she had become. That had to count for something. In early July, Dorothy received new orders. She was being pulled from frontline duty and reassigned to a training role back in England. The official reason was that her skills were too valuable to risk losing to a random artillery shell or sniper bullet, and that she could serve the war effort better by training other marksmen. The unofficial reason, which Lieutenant Chun told her privately, was that command was worried she was burning out, that the psychological strain of her role was destroying her, and that she needed to be taken out of combat before she broke completely. Dorothy felt conflicting emotions about the reassignment. Part of her was relieved, grateful to be removed from the daily horror of combat. Part of her felt like she was abandoning her duty, leaving other soldiers to face dangers that she was uniquely equipped to handle. And part of her, a part that frightened her when she examined it too closely, felt disappointed that she wouldn't be able to continue doing the one thing she had proven she was exceptional at. That part of her had found meaning in the clarity of combat, where every problem had a solution, and every solution involved pulling a trigger. What would she do in a world where violence wasn't the answer? Before she left France, Dorothy was summoned to division headquarters and informed that she was being recommended for a Bronze Star for Valor, specifically for her actions on D-Day and during the subsequent push inland. The citation mentioned her 23 confirmed kills and the impact her precision fire had on the success of the Normandy invasion. It was a significant honor, recognition that her service mattered, that what she had done had saved American lives even as she took German ones. But the award ceremony was private, classified, because officially Dorothy Mae Sullivan didn't exist in any combat role. She couldn't be publicly recognized for being something the military didn't acknowledge existed. She was flown back to England on a transport plane carrying wounded soldiers, men with missing limbs and shattered bodies, men who would never see combat again and were grateful for it. Dorothy sat among them feeling like a fraud, physically intact when so many had given so much more visibly. A sergeant with bandages covering half his face asked her what her role had been, and she told him she was a specialist, which told him nothing and satisfied his curiosity. He talked about how he couldn't wait to go home, to see his family, to never hear gunfire again. Dorothy nodded along but couldn't share his enthusiasm because she didn't know who she would be without the war, without the mission, without the rifle in her hands. The soldiers she was training didn't know what to make of her. She was a woman, which was unusual enough in a training role, but she was also aloof and demanding in ways that made her difficult to connect with. She didn't socialize with other instructors, didn't participate in the casual camaraderie that made military life bearable. She spent her off-duty hours alone, either practicing her own marksmanship or maintaining her rifle with obsessive care. The other instructors complained that she was setting unrealistic standards, that she was demoralizing soldiers by being impossibly good at something they would never match. The base commander, a colonel named Patterson who had served in World War I and understood combat trauma, even if nobody called it that back then, called Dorothy into his office for a conversation. He told her bluntly that she was failing as an instructor, not because she lacked knowledge or skill, but because she had forgotten how to communicate with people who hadn't experienced what she had experienced. She was teaching technique, when what these soldiers needed was confidence. She was demanding perfection, when adequate would keep them alive. Patterson told her that if she wanted to actually help these men, She needed to find a way to bridge the gap between her experience and theirs. Dorothy thought about what Patterson had said and slowly began to change her approach. Instead of trying to turn average soldiers into exceptional marksmen, she focused on teaching them to be reliably competent at the distances they would actually be shooting in combat. Instead of demonstrating impossible shots that discouraged them, she showed them practical techniques they could actually use. She started telling stories from combat, not about her own achievements, but about the small things that made the difference between surviving and dying. How to clean your rifle in the rain. How to judge distance by counting fence posts. How to stay calm when someone was shooting at you. The soldiers responded to this practical knowledge in ways they hadn't responded to her demands for perfection. One evening, a young private from Ohio named Miller approached Dorothy after a training session. He asked her directly if she had killed anyone, if she had actually been in combat. Dorothy considered lying, considered giving him the standard evasion about her role being classified. But she looked at this 18-year-old kid who was going to be sent to fight in a few weeks, and she decided he deserved honesty. She told him yes, she had been in combat. She had killed men. She had seen things that haunted her every night. And the reason she was pushing him so hard in training was because every shot he missed on this range might be a shot that missed in combat, which might mean his death or the death of one of his friends. Miller nodded slowly, then asked the question Dorothy had been avoiding thinking about. Was it worth it? The killing, the nightmares, the weight of all those deaths? Dorothy didn't have a good answer. She told him that asking if war was worth it was like asking if survival was worth it when you were drowning. You did what you had to do in the moment, and you dealt with the consequences later. Whether it was worth, it wouldn't be clear until the war was over and you could see what kind of world you had helped create. Miller seemed satisfied with this non-answer, or at least he stopped asking questions, and Dorothy went back to her barracks feeling like she had finally said something true about her experience. The war in Europe continued to the fall of 1944 and into 1945. Dorothy remained in England, training soldiers, maintaining her skills, waiting for orders that never came to return to combat. She heard about the push across France, about the Battle of the Bulge, about the final collapse of Nazi Germany. She felt disconnected from these events, like she was watching history happen to someone else. The soldiers she had trained were fighting and dying, putting into practice the skills she had taught them, while she remained safely in England doing what felt increasingly like meaningless work. In April 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Berlin, Dorothy received a visit from Colonel Hastings, her old instructor from OSS training. Hastings had been promoted and was now involved in planning for the post-war period. He told Dorothy that the Office of Strategic Services was being reorganized, that there would be opportunities for specialists like her in intelligence apparatus that would be needed in the Cold War that everyone saw coming. He asked if she would be interested in continuing her service, perhaps in a different capacity that utilized her unique skills. Dorothy surprised herself by saying no. She had been thinking about this for months, about who she was and who she wanted to be. And she had come to realize that the coldness that made her such an effective sniper was also making it impossible for her to imagine a normal life. She needed to find out if she could be something other than a weapon, if there was a version of Dorothy Mae Sullivan that could exist without war. The only way to know was to try, and that meant going home. Hastings didn't argue. He told her he understood that many of the best operators struggle with peace because they have been optimized for war. He warned her that the transition would be difficult, that civilian life would feel empty and meaningless after the intensity of combat. But he also told her that if she could make it work, if she could find purpose outside of violence, she would be one of the rare ones who managed to save themselves. He shook her hand, told her she had served with distinction, and wished her luck. Dorothy watched him walk away and wondered if she had just made the right decision or the worst mistake of her life. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Germany surrendered, and suddenly the massive military machine that had been built to fight the Nazis began to wind down. Millions of soldiers would be going home, transitioning back to civilian life, try to become the people they had been before the war. Dorothy was among them, processed through demobilization with the same bureaucratic efficiency that had processed her into service. She turned in most of her equipment, but was allowed to keep her modified M1 Garand, which technically violated regulations but which nobody seemed interested in enforcing. The rifle had become part of her identity in ways that made surrendering it feel like surrendering a piece of herself. When Dorothy returned to Shelby, Montana, in June 1945, she found her hometown frozen in time. The same streets, the same buildings, the same people who had been there when she left. Her parents met her at the train station, and the reunion was emotional in ways that Dorothy had stopped allowing herself to feel. Her mother cried, holding Dorothy like she was afraid she might disappear again. Her father stood back, watching his daughter with eyes that understood what she wasn't saying, eyes that had seen their own share of combat in a different war. They drove home in near silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much. She tried to slip back into her old life, working at the general store, helping on her parents' farm, doing the ordinary things that ordinary people did. But she found that ordinary life felt unbearable after combat. Everything seemed trivial, meaningless. People complained about small problems that weren't problems at all. They worried about things that didn't matter. They lived their lives without any understanding of how fragile and temporary everything was. Dorothy wanted to shake them, to tell them that they were wasting the peace that she and millions like her had paid for in blood, but she knew that wouldn't be fair. This was what peace looked like. This was what they had been fighting for. The fact that it felt empty to her was her problem, not theirs. The nightmares got worse. Without the distraction of training or the structure of military life, Dorothy had nothing to occupy her mind except memories she didn't want. She dreamed about the men she had killed, saw their faces with perfect clarity, even though she had only seen most of them through a rifle scope. She dreamed about the church tower, about the German observer falling backward, about wondering if he had children who would grow up without a father because of her. She dreamed about Omaha Beach, about bodies in the surf, about the sounds of men dying. She woke up multiple times every night, gasping and disoriented, and her mother would hear her crying and not know what to do to help. Months passed. Dorothy existed more than lived, going through the motions of ordinary life, while feeling like a ghost haunting her own existence. Her parents watched her deteriorate with helpless concern. Her mother tried to involve her in church activities, in social events, in anything that might reconnect her with the community. Her father tried to give her space, understanding that sometimes the only way to heal was to work through it yourself. Neither approach worked because Dorothy was dealing with something that neither of them could fully understand. Dorothy found herself opening up in ways she hadn't been able to with anyone in Shelby. She told them about her role, about the killing, about the nightmares. Nobody judged her. Nobody offered meaningless platitudes. They just listened and shared their own struggles. And for the first time since coming home, Dorothy felt understood. Chin told her something that resonated deeply. The hardest part of war wasn't surviving combat. It was surviving peace afterward. The war had taken pieces of all of them, and they would never get those pieces back. But they could learn to live as changed people. They could find new purposes, new meanings, new ways to be human. There are other stories like Dorothy's, other women and men who served in ways that were never officially recognized, who made sacrifices that were never properly acknowledged, who carried burdens that society preferred to ignore. We're committed to finding these stories and telling them with the respect and depth they deserve. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories that challenge what you thought you knew about history and honor the complexity of human experience during war, then there's another story waiting for you. Click on the next video to continue this journey with us, to discover another voice that history tried to silence, another life that deserves to be remembered.